Welcome, everyone, to Sunday morning at the Marxist Library. A quick note before we start, this session is being recorded and will be posted on YouTube with the link on our website, ICSSmarx.org, within the next few days. Before the pandemic, this weekly program was hosted at the Neville Proctor Marxist Library located in Oakland, California, USA. During the pandemic, we have been meeting every Sunday morning on Zoom. In fact, we now have participants from all over the United States and even some from around the world. So I want to wish you a good morning, a good afternoon, and a good evening. We've been offering Sunday morning programs now for over a decade and a half. You can sign up for email notifications for future programs, view our past programs, and contact us through our website at ICSSmarx.org. And of course, we always welcome input, feedback, suggestions for topics, and speakers. My name is Alan Miller, and I'm a member of the program committee that organizes the Sunday morning at the Marxist Library sessions. Before we start, we wish to remind everyone that this is a comradely forum for political discourse and debate. As such, we ask that you show respect to our participants and the moderator of today's session. Please note that the opinions expressed are those of the speaker and participants. They do not necessarily represent those of the ICSS or the Marxist Library. Our presentation today will run for about an hour, followed by a short break for announcements, followed by Q&A until about 12 p.m. We're going to make it a slightly shorter session today. Our session today is Eyewitness Crimea and Russia, and our speaker is Rick Sterling, who will be speaking about his recent trip to Russia and Crimea. Rick Sterling is a Bay Area journalist who's active in the Mount Diablo Peace and Justice Center, the Task Force on the Americas, and Veterans for Peace East Bay chapter. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Rick. So go ahead and take it away, Rick.
Okay, thanks very much, Alan, and welcome everybody. It's nice to be here. And I see a number of familiar faces, and hi to my friends and people I work with in different organizations. So just a couple of points. Dan and I have been writing, we're writing a set of 3 articles. The first one has been published. It's called Journey to St. Petersburg, Moscow, and Crimea. It's published at antiwar.com and LA Progressive and other Dissident Voice and other sites. The second and third articles about our trip are going to be published at the same sites. I know from Eric Garris at antiwar.com that it's going to be published there this coming Tuesday and Thursday. So I would encourage people to go to antiwar.com, which is an outstanding site, and you can see our article there, and you can see daily news about the events in Ukraine, Russia, and around the world. As well, I'm going to be compiling a set of photographs. We're including a few photographs with our articles, but we're going to be compiling a set of photographs to make a slideshow, and I will give the link to that when we've finished to Alan or to Jean, and they can send out the link in the ICSS emails. I'm looking forward to the Q&A part of this program, and during my presentation, I'll talk about various aspects. I'll begin with how we got there, how we got to Russia. As many of you know, Russia's under severe sanctions. No airlines are allowed to travel from Western countries to Russia. And so we flew to Helsinki, Finland, and then went by land into St. Petersburg. Just by way of background, Dan Kovalik went to the Donbass in last November. And when I heard he was doing another trip, I was curious, and he invited me to join him. And as it turned out, we couldn't get to the Donbass because we had tourist visas rather than journalist visas, and the situation has changed in the Donbass. It's now the customs is controlled by Russia rather than the DPR or LPR, the Donetsk People's Republic, or the Lugansk People's Republic. When Dan had gone there in November, it was fine to have the tourist visa, but it was no longer possible. So we had to change plans. In any case, I flew from San Francisco. Dan was flying from Pittsburgh, where he lives. We had a bunch of problems at the beginning. Dan's flight to London was from Pittsburgh was canceled, and then they rerouted him through Dallas, Texas, which anybody who knows anything about geography will know isn't a very direct way to Helsinki. And then he finally made it to Helsinki. I went via Istanbul, which again is a long ways out of the way. My luggage was lost en route, but finally it did arrive in Helsinki. And we had a friend who was driving over from St. Petersburg to pick us up in Helsinki, and he had his car break down en route. And then they sent a taxi to pick us up at the airport, but they sent it to the wrong hotel, so we were waiting. And finally, we arrived about 4 a.m. in St. Petersburg after a very long trip, and riding in the cab. 4 people scrunched into the cab of the tow truck, which was towing our broken down vehicle. In any case, I guess my first impression of St. Petersburg was very positive. I've been there twice before, in 2016 and 2017, but at that time I was part of delegations, and it seemed like we had less time for just walking around and seeing the streets and meeting people randomly. And we had that ability this time around. Which was very nice. St. Petersburg is it's a very large city. The buildings are in very good shape. A lot of the buildings are 100 or 150 years old, despite the damage which was inflicted in World War II. The buildings are looking very good, actually. The streets are remarkably clean. And we saw the reason why, because you would see street cleaners going around day and night. These are motorized street cleaners. And it's kind of striking coming from the Western cities where streets are where cities are getting run down frequently. Another thing that struck me just walking around was the number of museums. Through my work, I had occasion to go to Antarctica 4 times. So when I saw that they had a Museum of Arctic and Antarctic Research, it piqued my interest. So I went into that museum, and it was really impressive, describing both Russian and international exploration in the Arctic and Antarctica. So that was just an interesting thing. Walking around the streets in both St. Petersburg and Moscow, and then, well, to a lesser extent, the cities in Crimea. We were so busy in Crimea that we had less time for that. But in Moscow and St. Petersburg, Moscow is around 15 million people, so it's a big city. But walking around the streets there, it was struck by we saw very few impoverished people. We did see, I think I saw 3 people that were more or less begging, but that was it. who knows how many, impoverished people are not visible, but, there is that, that surface impression. The streets are very vibrant from early in the morning till late at night. Lots of people on the streets. The avenues are broad. And it's kind of impressive to see the number of people. Of course, many people have commented on the subway system in Moscow. Leningrad or St. Petersburg has a similar excellent subway system, metro system, that is inexpensive, that is very fast, efficient, and modern. They've got USB chargers between the seats in the Moscow subway, I noticed, for example. If you miss your subway, don't worry, because the next one is going to be along in 2 minutes. They're that fast. In fact, it sometimes takes longer to go down on the escalator than it does to wait for the next subway, because the subway systems are so deep. The escalators are going down, about 75 yards. So they're going down a long ways, maybe even 100 yards, the length of a football field. But that's a surface impression. Some of you might be curious to know about the prices. Just to give you a sense, there are about 80 rubles to the dollar now. In St. Petersburg, we stayed in the Best Western Plus hotel, which is a little bit ironic since Dan and I are both pretty anti-Western imperialism, at least. But it turned out that the Best Western Plus was the best option for us. We had a beautiful 2-room suite overlooking a plaza and the Moscow train station. Very impressive. It was about $75 a night. That was for the whole suite. So we were splitting that 2 ways. In Moscow, we stayed in the Sunflower Avenue Hotel. We had individual rooms there. It was about $50 a night, but that included a very deluxe buffet breakfast. So it's relatively inexpensive. We used zenhotels.com, which allowed us to use our Western credit cards. I don't know how they're doing that, but they're succeeding in it. So that was very handy. So we didn't have to have cash, and so that we could make reservations in advance. So I would highly recommend zenhotels.com. In Moscow, it turned out we were a couple of blocks from the largest mosque in Europe, which is the Moscow Mosque, and it's very new. It was just completed a couple of years ago, I guess. I was walking around on Friday around noontime when they let out from Friday afternoon prayers, and it must have been at capacity, because it was like watching the crowd streaming out, packed from a sporting arena or stadium, the people coming out of the Moscow Mosque. So that was something that was a little bit surprising. The mosque is beautiful. It was partly paid for by the government. The Russian government supports both religion in a certain sense. They do for the mosques, and they certainly do for the Eastern Orthodox Christian churches. And I don't know if there's some other faiths, synagogues or whatever, that are also supported by the state, but those are. In Moscow, it was really interesting just walking around. I've never seen the movie. Probably some of you saw the movie Gorky Park, which might have been based on a book. And I kind of have I imagine it as being pretty dark and negative, which was kind of ironic because the Gorky Park, the real Gorky Park, is brimming over with flowers and children and fun activity. It's a beautiful park. There's very nice outdoor restaurants there. They've got kids parks with terrific slides and swings and all sorts of kids activities, some of which I've never seen in North American parks. And so it's very positive. And across the Moscow River is the Ministry of Defense. They've got a beautiful walkway along the Moscow River in that part of the city. Many of you will be curious to know what people were saying about the war and so forth. And we received a range of viewpoints, but the big majority was that the war is sad, it's tragic, but it was necessary. And many people are concerned that it's going on. Some people are expressing the opinion that they should take the gloves off and that they should attack much more aggressively. If you read the Western media, and from talking to a friend a couple of days ago, there's the impression that it's the brutal invasion, that Russia's purposely bombing apartment buildings and destroying civilian structures and so forth. And I think the evidence is, if you dig below the surface, I think the evidence is not there to support that. There was somebody, an American military reporter commented early on that the U.S. dropped more bombs in one day in the invasion of Iraq than Russia had used in 1 month. So just in terms of the number of missiles, and also I believe it's the case that Russia is avoiding civilian casualties because their goal is not to hurt the Ukrainian people, who they do view as brothers and sisters. It's to demilitarize Russia, and especially since NATO has NATOized the Ukrainian military. But that may come up in the Q&A later on. People in Russia are lots of people are very patriotic. They remember World War II quite vividly, not personally, unless they're very old, but through their parents and grandparents. May 9 is Victory Day, which is a day honoring the people who died in World War II and the importance of the victory over fascism. And it's celebrated because of the threat of terrorist attacks. And I'll note that while we were there was the drone attack on the Kremlin, which I think was more symbolic than real, but there is the threat of real attacks. Because of that, they closed down some of the public, or they did not have some of the public celebrations of May 9 Victory Day that they ordinarily have. Regarding terrorism, we did go to the scene of the bombing of which killed the Russian journalist Vladlen Tatarsky. It injured 30 other people. It was in a cafe bordering the Neva River and adjacent to St. Petersburg State University. So that was a bomb that targeted that Russian journalist, and of course Darya Dugin was killed in a bomb explosion, and there were other explosions in the south. So they have some real security concerns. Now, in terms of the railway system, we traveled from St. Petersburg to Moscow, and I would highly recommend the Sapsan Railway. Sapsan is Russian for falcon, It's a very fast train. Maximum speed of the train is 150 miles an hour. We were running up to 120 miles an hour. And so you make the journey from St. Petersburg to Moscow in about 4 hours. And it's smooth. It's smooth and quiet and comfortable. You do need to book your tickets in advance. The train system is very well used. We had a good experience with the website russianrailways.com. There's an English version of it, and again, you can pay using a Western credit card. So you do need to make reservations for the train trips. And then between Moscow and Crimea, that is a 27-hour journey. And there it's they've got sleeping compartments. And it's interesting, they've got kind of a nice design where there's 4 people to a compartment, and you've got bunk beds on either side of the compartment. And it's reasonably comfortable. I would recommend if you've got a choice and you're going there, don't get the double-decker trains because the overhead is lower, and I think the single-decker are more comfortable from our experience. Dan has commented on the friendliness of people. When we kind of intended to book to be in the same compartment because but didn't quite understand the layout, the selection layout at the website, and we ended up being in adjacent but different compartments. So we each had 3 different, compartment companions. But in both of our cases, the people were quite friendly. We had both of us had, Russian travel companions who spoke a little bit of English, and then we were using the translators on our phone, which are quite good actually nowadays. I think I think it's from Yandex, which is a big Russian software company. It's called Translate, and that app allows you to go back and forth between Russian and English, and you can either type in your comment to which you want to have translated, or you can vocalize it. But that's very, very useful. Crimea was amazing. I was in Crimea in 2016. So I knew the big picture. I knew that the people there were strongly supportive of Russia, and were so happy with reunifying with the Russian Federation, and that they had absolutely no regrets, despite the fact that Ukraine punished them by cutting off the electrical supply. So they were many months without electricity until a new power station was built. And then Ukraine cut off the fresh water supply that was coming in a canal from the Dnieper River. Ukraine put a dam in the canal to cut off the water supply. Of course, after Russia's intervention, they demolished the dam, and so the water supply has been returned. But even before then, when I was there in 2016, there were no regrets about what they called the reunification with Russia. So why do they call it the reunification? Because the answer is simply because Crimea was part of Russia since 1783. And most especially the Sevastopol port, which has been a Navy port for the Russian Navy since that same year, 1783, which is the year that Catherine the Great defeated the Ottomans, and they took possession of Crimea. Now, in 1954, the Ukrainian premier of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, for whatever reasons, he decided that Crimea should be part of the Socialist Republic of Ukraine. There was, some level of disagreement, unhappiness in Crimea about that, but it wasn't a big thing since they were all part of the same country, the USSR. That became a big thing when the Soviet Union started to come apart. And so in 1991, a referendum was held in January of that year, actually. In January 1991, a referendum was held over whether to form the Crimean Republic of, or the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, the ARC. That was, and secede from Ukraine. That was overwhelmingly supported, but Kiev did not agree to it, and there was contention. And ultimately, they agreed that that Crimea would remain as the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, but under Ukrainian administration. So they had a level of autonomy, but within Ukraine. And in a lot of ways, it's quite similar to what Donetsk and Lugansk was asking for, the Donbass, after the 2014 coup and in the Minsk Accords. That, basically it was a level of autonomy where they can have Russian as a state language, where they can have Russian language in the schools and in the government business and so forth. In any case, that referendum in 1991 went through, but Crimea remained a part of the Ukraine. And that all changed in 2014 when you had the coup in Kiev. I'll talk more about what we learned about the details of that, but just briefly, after the coup unfolded, there was a sense of urgency that they had to get out of Ukraine, that Ukraine no longer supported them, that Ukraine was hostile to them, to the vast majority of people, and the people really demanded a referendum and seceding from Ukraine. And that took place on, the referendum took place on March 16, and then the decision, the plea from the Crimean Parliament to the Russian Federation was subsequently done very soon after, just a day or two, and then a day or two after that, Moscow accepted the request or the plea from Crimea, and Crimea became part of the Russian Federation. Let's see. I want to say a little bit more about that process, because one of our real goals in going to Crimea was to learn the details of this transition, how it happened, and we got a lot of interesting information. Now, previously, I knew about the Korsun bus massacre, and this was a massacre of Crimean citizens who had gone in a convoy of 8 buses. So there was about 400 Crimeans who had gone to Kiev to do what they called the anti-Maidan, which is they wanted to go and peacefully protest in support of the government and against the chaos and the violence which was unfolding in the Maidan Plaza. They did that, but then on February 20, the major massacre of people took place. There were 47 killed by snipers and 47 total of both police and protesters. For those of you who don't know, I'm sure that some of you do know about the work of Ivan Ketchenovsky. He's a Ukrainian Canadian professor at the University of Ottawa. He's done a detailed research and examination from way back when, from starting in 2014. But he's done incredible research which conclusively proves that the snipers were located in opposition-controlled buildings. And he determined that by, among other things, examining the forensic details of the corpses and looking at where bullet wound entries and exits were and what the angle of firing must have been, and so what building was in that direction, because you have a tremendous number of videos and audio recordings of what was going on the Maidan. So he's done rigorous research on that, and I highly recommend his research. But before that happened, as soon after the Maidan protests began in November of 2013, the Autonomous Republic of Crimea Parliament and the president of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea were issuing statements and were passing resolutions decrying what was happening and encouraging the government to try to, you can't just allow random violence to go on in the Maidan Plaza. And because early on there was, although the protests began peacefully, quite quickly they got taken over by the right-wing extremist parties. So there's a tremendous set of documents that are in a book. The book is titled To Go One's Way, and there's tremendous documentary evidence about the statements and the resolutions that were issued by the Crimean Parliament decrying what was going on in Kiev. And that's part of the evidence showing that they had been both speaking out about this and identifying it correctly as ultra-nationalist and Russophobic and decrying the hate speech that was going on there, identifying the right sector and the other leading violent forces that were taking control of the protests. So we're working on it. Currently, we have not found, and I don't believe there is any this evidence is not online anywhere. It's been published in this book, which was put out by the president of Crimea, and there's an English translation of the book, and he's got this documentary evidence, but it's not available online. So we're working hard to get that posted online so that people can refer to it, because it's very important from a legal standpoint to show that Crimea was justified and that the secession of Crimea from Ukraine and the unification with Russia is legally justified by international law. Of course, they did all sorts of things in their transition that were never done with the breakup of Yugoslavia and Kosovo and so forth. But we're working hard to get this documentary evidence, because the statements are very explicit, and the fact that they were written 3 months, they were warning about the threat to the national unity. They were warning from Crimea, this is endangering the unity of Ukraine, where we're heading. So they were calling it out that early on. One of the events one of the new pieces of information, or another new piece of information we learned, is that in January, there were attacks on the statues of Lenin in Simferopol, which is the capital of Crimea, and Yalta. There are statues of, big imposing statues of Lenin, which is a tribute to the Soviet Union, to the Russian Revolution, and to Russia. And so the attacks from Ukrainian ultranationalists, some of them who came into Crimea to do this, were countered by much larger groups of Crimeans. And they defended and stopped the destruction of the Lenin statues because they correctly saw it as an attack on Russia and the Soviet Union, and I guess they believe that there should be respect for those, even though probably some of the protesters, or maybe even many of them, don't necessarily support Lenin or the Soviet Union, but they saw it as a threat to their Russian and Soviet history and past. And so they stopped them in those two different locations. We heard the same thing when we talked to people in Yalta and the people in Simferopol. So that was really interesting. So then, now I mentioned previously that I was in Crimea in 2016. And when we were there, we immediately found that, well, our credit cards don't work. And we learned that all of the tour ships who used to come and dock in Yalta, they had stopped. And there were other effects of the Western sanctions, because the Western sanctions on Russia began in 2014. They didn't just begin after the special military operation. But a big turning point was when Russia accepted the plea from Crimea to reunify or to absorb Crimea. The U.S. and the West started imposing sanctions on Russia, and especially on Crimea. So Crimean universities, their credentials would not be recognized in Western Europe or the West generally. And there were other examples of this. But it was the beginning. That was the beginning. And what we learned in 2016, and this was about 2 years after the sanctions began, because we were there in May of 2016. So it was 2 years after the sanctions had begun. What people said to us, it was the best thing possible for Russian agriculture. Several people commented on how Russian agriculture had boomed because they could no longer import some of the food and vegetables and other food products from West Europe that they had previously relied on. So a lot of investments had been made and in Russian agriculture. So that was one of the consequences. And I think, thinking back on it, I think that lesson was learned by Russia, and that's had a big impact on their ability to withstand the latest, most intense round of sanctions. By the way, when we were on that trip in 2016, we visited Krasnodar, which is a city due east of Crimea in mainland Russia. It's about maybe 150 miles east of Crimea, or less than that, 175 or 100 miles east. And we visited an agricultural enterprise that was just astounding. It was football-sized field greenhouses that were which were automatically controlled. You had a sprinkler system that was computer controlled. You had the soil was raised, and they would bring in soil beds and grow tomatoes and cucumbers, and that was it primarily, maybe some other vegetables. But they had an automated system that was just mass producing very high quality vegetables. And the people who were working there were, running forklifts and doing various activities. But it was, it was not, so there were workers there, but they were not traditional farmers or They were not tilling the soil. They were doing other things at a higher technical level, and so that was impressive to see. I've never seen anything like that in North America. I don't know if it exists. It may exist, and I just haven't seen it. But it was very impressive, and it was an example of the marriage of high tech with traditional, traditional needs, and extremely efficient and productive. An oligarch had invested in this. The oligarch owned a big chain of supermarkets, and he wanted to have high quality produce, and so it was vertical integration. He was producing the vegetables himself, through his own company. So that was very interesting to see. In terms of this relates to the question of sanctions. Of course, when Russia invaded Ukraine, February 24 of 2022, within a day, within 24 hours, all of these sanctions were laid down by the West. Pretty clearly, they had been prepared in advance, and I'll have comments to say about that later. But my observation is that the sanctions have not had anywhere near the destructive effect that the West had been counting on and predicting. For example, we went into numerous stores in the cities in both Moscow and St. Petersburg, as well as we were in stores in Crimea, big stores and little stores. There's absolutely no shortage of first-class commodities, whether it's sporting goods or clothing or food, whatever it is. The shelves are stocked, and not only are they stocked, there's lots of customers because they have had less price inflation than most Western countries. There has been some price inflation, but it's nowhere near what it is in the West. So, on a surface level, it's hard to see the impact of the sanctions. We asked numerous people about the sanctions. The sanctions have had an impact on travel. Russians used to travel to West Europe, and they cannot easily do that now. They need a visa, whereas in the past they didn't, and the visa may be very difficult to get. So what's happened is that Russian tourists who used to travel to Western Europe are now traveling around their own huge country. For example, in St. Petersburg, I talked with somebody who owns a souvenir shop near the university, near St. Petersburg State University. It was actually just down the street from the cafe where the bombing of Vladimir Tartarsky took place. But in any case, this tourist shop, the owner of it, I asked, aren't you suffering from the lack of European tourists? And she said, no, we've got Russian tourists now. So that was kind of and other people told us the same thing, that there is some inconvenience and they don't like it. Of course, it affects some people, athletes, it can affect severely. And, other people, other individuals that are more reliant on the West, it will have a big impact on them. But for the average Russian citizen, what we heard is that it hasn't had much impact. There is not, unemployment level is low. And for example, I saw in one little shopping center, or not a shopping center, but a little grocery store in Moscow, I saw this this flyer at the exit door with tear off, little piece of paper you could tear off, and it had a nice photo. And what it was they were advertising. The image was of a cashier and somebody for loading the shelves. So they had a nice image of the job, a cashier, and then a tear-off part below it. So that if you were interested in this job, you could phone that number and learn about it, or you were interested in the stocking the shelves, you could tear it off. And there were a few people, a few of the tear-offs had been taken, but there were quite a few there. We heard that generally there, unemployment is not a big problem in Russia. So there's been little inflation, there's been little unemployment, and there's lots of goods. So the Western sanctions intended to crush Russia have failed. It's clear that the US and the West was believing its own propaganda, that the ultimate slur was Russia's not a country, or it's a big gas station masquerading as a country. The most stupid the people who say that I have little respect for, because they're denying the fact, the simple fact that Russia has had tremendous level of culture and has contributed to the world, whether it's the first cosmonaut in space, or Tchaikovsky, or Tolstoy, or the ballet dancers, the symphony, whatever it is, the fantastic athletes, whatever kind of performance you're talking about, Russia has made very good contributions in the scientific world, artistic world, literary world, and to try to demean them in that way reflects on the person who's making that comment. And the failure to crush the Russian economy, the evident resilience of the Russian economy is the proof of it. So after, as I was saying, the sanctions began after 2014 with Crimea, and maybe you can, if you want to close that, excuse me for a minute. Yeah. One area that the sanctions really took off in which I've commented in the past in previous webinars with ICSS, is in the sporting world. And the World Anti-Doping Agency was harnessed to wage a campaign against Russia, and they have been excluded from beginning with the Rio de Janeiro Olympics, Summer Olympics in 2016, and since then, Russian athletes have either been excluded, or they've been many of them have been excluded, including Paralympic athletes, and there have been charges made. There was a charge from a report from the World Anti-Doping Agency that more than 1,000 Russians benefited from the state-sponsored doping scheme. You don't hear that so much about that now, but since I've followed it, I happen to know that after making that huge claim and that huge accusation, they couldn't muster more than 100 charges, which they took to the Court of Arbitration for Sports, and that was whittled down to about 15 or 20 Russian athletes who were involved with doping. But the huge numbers and the state-sponsored accusation and so forth has been discredited, and many of the athletes, when they had the resources to challenge it, the vast majority of them have been found to be innocent. So anyway, that's the sanctions have taken the place. The sanctions have involved the sporting world, and more recently they involved, since the invasion of Ukraine, they've extended to the literary world and the music world, and symphonies, symphony conductors and artists and so forth, as you know. But they have they have largely failed to suppress the vast majority of Russian people or impose harsh conditions on them. Now, talking about a little bit more about Crimea, we visited a very interesting place there, which is now a museum, but it's a museum at the site where they loaded nuclear missiles on submarines. And this is under a mountain, so it could withstand any attack. And it's at the port of Sevastopol, which is about an hour and a half from the port city of Yalta. Anyway, Balaclava has this submarine museum, and it's a first-class museum, and it's got all sorts of educational panels about the danger of nuclear war, what happens when there's a nuclear explosion, how the U.S. bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and why the Soviet Union developed its own nuclear capacity and feels, on a defensive measure, they have to be able to have a means of retaliation to stop the U.S. from ever bombing Russia. So they had this site which was under the mountain, and so nuclear submarines could go in there and be refitted or be loaded with nuclear missiles. And there's an actual submarine in there, and there's all sorts of displays for educational matters. And it's very impressive, and it shows the seriousness of Russia, because they obviously have a nuclear capacity now, which they have developed. The nuclear ports are in the Baltics and in Vladivostok, and who knows, we don't know where else. It's probably classified. But it kind of underscores the danger. And it was interesting to go in there because there were lots of school children. There was one or two classes of children going through this museum and learning about the dangers of nuclear war and the risks. And also, I mean, as a matter of fact, they point out there's only one country that's used this, and that is the United States. And moreover, they did it against Japan when Japan was on its knees and on the verge of quitting the war anyway. Nevertheless, the U.S. dropped the bombs, and many people believe that was primarily to send a signal to Russia. In any case, they do value education. In the museum dedicated to Arctic and Antarctic research, also there were school children in there who were learning about Russian and Soviet research in the North and South Poles. Another museum that we went into, these museums were educational from a political standpoint, was the Partisan Museum in the city of Sevastopol. Now, when I say city, Simferopol and Sevastopol are small cities with approximately 500,000 residents. So they are small cities. In any case, Sevastopol was the scene of huge fighting in World War II. Nazi Germany threw a lot into the effort to conquer Crimea, and they did. So the Nazis were in control of Crimea for about 18 months. And the 7th of March of 1944, when the Red Army liberated Crimea, is celebrated very much in Sevastopol and throughout Crimea. But this just underscores the fact that their history, they have an appreciation and a consciousness of Nazism and war that we in the United States and Canada just cannot have, because they suffered. they know what Nazism is. It isn't some Yahoo, who's saluting Hitler. That's not Nazism. That's one person who's a little bit wacky, probably. Nazism is, your city and your region being totally controlled, with people killed en mass graves all over the place. Anyway, we went into the Partisan Museum, which was very interesting. It was a house that was the meeting place of partisans who were mobilizing and planning for sabotage campaigns against the Nazis, and they had under the floorboard. There was a basement. There was a secret path to a basement, and they had a print shop down there where they printed flyers, and which they distributed. And in the backyard, they had weapons buried under the ground. So this was very interesting, and it just underscored the different level of consciousness. My feeling in so many ways, we were welcomed there, and as soon as people learned that Dan and I are Americans, they made a special effort to say welcome, and we want peace, and we want friendship. They have no hostility to American individuals, but they do understand the U.S. government. And the dreams of maybe the 1980s and the start of the 1990s that a new, better life was going to be ready for them and inviting to them. I think they've realized those dreams were not realistic, and they're increasingly looking east. But they welcome peace and friendship, and they don't want. Most above all, they don't want war, and that was our sense in many ways. Now, Alan asked me to talk about some of the main propaganda talking points, or some of the main criticisms of the Russian intervention, and so I'll do that briefly. How are we doing on time? It's 11:30.
It's 11:30.
Yeah, so I'll go a little bit more and have some time for questions. One question is about inter-imperialist rivalry. Some people believe that the U.S. is an empire and Russia's an empire, and the U.S. is trying to control governments, and Russia's trying to control governments and dominate governments. I think that's very inaccurate, and I don't think that's the case. I think Russia intervened in Ukraine because they felt threatened. And the NATO has been expanding, of course, since 1999. And NATO, the US withdrew from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. They withdrew from the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. These are big threats, especially when the US and NATO installs missiles in Romania and Poland, which can be fitted with nuclear attack missiles. There is a real threat of the NATO launching a first strike. And of course, if you launched a first strike, what you need to have ready is your anti-ballistic missiles ready to counter the return fire. And that's why the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty was so important, and why it was such a huge thing when Bush II withdrew from the ABM Treaty in 2002. Russia's made no effort to pressure or to threaten the Baltic states, and they made a lot of efforts to do something different in Ukraine. They supported efforts. They said it was fine for Ukraine to be part of the EU, but why couldn't they also be friends with Russia and have agreements with both and be a legitimate bridge between the two? The real danger to Russia, which they have made clear since 2007, was the Ukraine as a member of NATO being a threat to Russia, less than 500 miles from Moscow. I think the claim that Russia is imperialist, just like the U.S., is not supported by the facts. There's only one country in the world which claims to be exceptional, which has claims that which changes the rules according to its interpretation, so-called rules-based order. I think when Russia intervened in Syria, it was at the invitation of the Syrian government, and it was because the Syrian government was under legitimate threat from a cabal of countries who were using sectarian fanatics to attack it. And so Russia coming to the defense of Syria was in their interest, because they don't want to see fanatics succeeding in Syria and then perhaps expanding into Russia either. They don't want to see that. It was in their own interest, because Russia has had friendly relations and has had a port in Tartus in Syria for many decades. It's one of the few foreign ports that Russia has. So there's no question that was they knew that Assad prevailing in the conflict was in their interest, but it was completely legitimate, and any progressive should have also been supporting it. I think that John Mearsheimer recently, had some very concise and clear comments on this, which I think I'll take a couple of minutes to read, because I think they are so clear and concise. And here's what he had to say about whether did Putin have some options? I mean, didn't they have the option of not invading? I mean, couldn't they have waited? And here's what he said. This is John Mearsheimer, who's an establishment, but a highly respected establishment political science from the University of Chicago. He said, "No, I don't think Putin had any options. I do believe he was deeply committed to finding a negotiated settlement to the problem. He was deeply committed to the Minsk agreement, because what he wanted to do was shut down the conflict in the Donbass, that is in eastern Ukraine, so he would not have to invade. And with regard to NATO expansion, EU expansion, and the efforts to make Ukraine a Western bulwark on Russia's border, he went to great lengths to explain to the West why that was unacceptable. And on December 17, 2021, so just a few months before the invasion, Putin sent a letter to Biden and to NATO saying that you have to do X, Y, and Z so we can find a solution to this problem. And we refused to go along. And I think that Putin was left in a position where he felt he had no choice. Because, to answer your question, there was no other way to deal with the problem. So I think that he, with great reluctance, invaded Ukraine. And I believe that is true. And I think just as he did not want to invade Ukraine, I think the West wanted him. And primarily that's the US and the neocon foreign policy, which controls US foreign policy right now. They wanted Russia to invade Ukraine, and they intentionally provoked him and did everything possible for this to happen. The goal was to draw Russia into the intervention, and they believed it would ultimately destabilize Russia with their sanctions and with the war and with problems, just as happened in Afghanistan beginning in 1979. Of course, some people say, well, the West responded to Russia invading Afghanistan, which is the reverse of the truth. The West, that primarily the United States with Saudi Arabia, destabilized Afghanistan through the insertion of thousands of fanatical jihadis. And that is what destabilized the government to the point where they asked for some Russian support. Of course, Afghanistan is a neighboring country to Russia or to the Soviet Union. Brzezinski laid it all out. And of course, as many of you will know, Brzezinski was very proud of this. This was one of his biggest achievements because they contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union through the Afghan war. When somebody asked him, what was the destruction of Afghanistan? Was it worth it? And of course it was worth it. The bringing the Soviet Union down was much more valuable than some jihadis in Afghanistan. But in any case, he laid it all out then, and that is still the policy that's following today. And the Rand Corporation, in their evaluations, they did a report a couple of years ago about how to destabilize Russia. I mean, it's just explicit. I think the U.S. sees this as critical to maintaining the U.S. empire and the unipolar world, because Russia's a huge country geographically. It's a powerful country in terms of having many resources. Of course, it's got a large population as well. And now that it's linked up with and cemented ties with China, it's even stronger. Regarding my theory that the U.S. intentionally provoked Russia, of course, they've used unprovoked. Whenever the media and the establishment talks about Russia's intervention, it was an unprovoked intervention. Of course, it was totally provoked, in contrary. And regarding that, Hillary Clinton was quite clear. Of course, we know how she can be very explicit when she laughed about Muammar Gaddafi being executed. But she was similarly frank and blunt, because soon after the intervention by Russia, she was interviewed and she said it, Afghanistan is the model. And so I think that is true. I think the notion that there's interior imperialist rivalry and that we need to denounce Russia, just like we denounced the U.S. for invasion in Iraq, I think that's a totally false analysis, inaccurate analysis. I think what's really going on is Russia did everything possible to not have to do this because they knew it would be tragic. The U.S. did it intentionally because they wanted it to happen. It is not going the way they planned. So I think I'll stop there and look forward to questions.
Great, thank you, Rick. What we'd like to do now is just take a quick break and make a few announcements. First of all, I want to remind people that next week we have a special speaker, Greg Godels, will be speaking on the world economic situation, a bleak road ahead for the global economy. Greg is a blogger. He has a blog, ZZ's blog. He's also one of the editors at ML Today. Also, what I'd like to remind you is that you can sign up for our mailing list at our website, ICSSmarks.org. When you go to the website, a form comes up. If you sign up there, you will receive email notifications for future programs. You can also watch, there are links to our past programs, all of our past programs, going back over 10 years on YouTube that can be accessed from our website. Finally, I'd like to also note that you can contact us through the contact form at ICSSmarks.org, and you are also can make a contribution to support our activities there with information on the contact form. So with that, what I'd like to do is go ahead and take questions from participants. We can only go until about 12 o'clock, so I'd ask people to keep your questions short. And if you want to raise your hand, go to the reactions button at the bottom of your Zoom window and raise your hand, and we will call people as best we can in order. So with that, I'm going to start off with Janet, then I'm going to go to Richard and then Kit. So Janet, if you would unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes, okay, thank you. Hi, Rick. Several questions, quick ones. What dates were you there in Russia? And did you try to meet up with Edward Snowden? And then finally, I'm curious, why are you using the term invade as opposed to militarily intervene? That's it.
Shall I answer right away?
Yeah, we're going to take one question at a time.
Okay,
ahead.
that's fine. I left April 21, got there April 23. We were there 20 days. So end of April, beginning of May. No, we didn't try to locate Snowden. I wouldn't know how to do that. Certainly would have been interesting, but didn't do that. I understand. I prefer intervention. I use both terms, and you may have a point that it's better to avoid invade. Is it just semantic? I don't know. I use intervention in special military option. Sometimes I use invade too. We know the army sent troops, across the border into the area. So I think the more important question is, what's the purpose? What's the justification? And I tried to address those.
Thanks.
Okay, next is Richard, followed by Kit.
Hi there, Rick.
Richard Wright, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, it's interesting that you sort of brought up Mersheimer at the end. I think I just forwarded something in Counterpunch. I think it was Counterpunch or to a friend of mine who's a big Mersheimer fan. The reason I thought it was kind of interesting is because a lot of people bring him up in the context of Ukraine. But if I'm not mistaken, I think he is a conservative who thinks that Ukraine is that we shouldn't be doing Ukraine. We should be focusing on China. And in that context, did you talk to anybody in Russia as far as the assertion of the U.S. Draining Russian resources before they attack China? Thank you.
No, we didn't talk about that. And I think, we did talk with people about Russia's growing alliance with China, and people are understanding the need for Russia to look east to India, China, and other states. They've kind of given up on the West. There's that feeling. Yet at the same time, there's a lot of people, if they had their druthers, they would be friendly with Europe and North America. They realize that there are more cultural connections there than there are with China. It was interesting. We met, actually the same woman who ran the souvenir shop, who I mentioned when I was talking, who was saying that the customers are Russians now. All the Western European tourists have been replaced by Russians. She was commenting about the Chinese tourists and some of the cultural differences. And when they come in a big group, they don't respect her place. They put stuff on the floor and and she was quite critical. She said when there's individual families, there's no problem, but she was kind of down on the big tourist groups from China. I think there are cultural differences there, but we didn't talk about it beyond that, Richard, I'm afraid.
Okay, next is Kit, followed by Trajan, followed by Amihan, followed by Jean. So Kit, please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much for speaking, Rick. I'm really glad you got to go to Crimea and Russia. Are you planning to go back? And how much did this cost for you to go there? Another question is, are you going to present to other groups in the US? And are you going to be on the radio to talk about your experience? And then I have a question about those that greenhouse. Is it organic? Because I've heard that their produce is better than ours in some ways. Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, now regarding the vegetables, yes, it's organic. They've got very firm anti-GMO regulation in Russia, and they also had in Ukraine previously, and that has been eroded just recently. In fact, in the last, I'm not sure the time period, but in recent years, Ukrainian agriculture has been increasingly bought up, or Ukrainian lands has increasingly been bought up by Archer Daniels Midland and other big agribusiness companies in the U.S., which I think are playing a major factor, and they are changing the anti-GMO regulations. And by the way, the Oakland Institute has a good report on that issue. I know I personally have had some disagreements with them over a very bad report they did. They didn't write, but they published about Nicaragua. But they published, to their credit, they published a very good analysis and report on Ukraine. And I would recommend to people to look that up if you want details. Yes, it was organic. What were the other questions, Kit?
Rick, we would prefer actually if you didn't address the source of your funding for the trip.
Well, I was just wondering what the cost actually cost.
How much you think it would cost in general for people to go?
Okay, well, the funding of this trip, I paid for it all myself. I think it cost Turkish Airlines via Istanbul to Helsinki was less than $1,000 round trip, which is very reasonable considering all that distance. Probably spent $1,000 total in Russia. It's and Dan and I, are not being compensated by anyone, so it's out of our own pocket. And would I like to go back again? I would. And I made a point of getting another substantial cost, which I should add is the cost of a visa, which is $450 because you have to use a third party to go to reach the Washington Embassy of Russia, since they've shut down the San Francisco consulate and all the other and many other ones. In any case, but it's a 3-year visa. So it cost me $450 for a 3-year visa to Russia. I would love to go back. I might go back and do some more travels there. I think there are a lot of positive things in Russia that I like, and I'd like to learn more. So, I don't have any plans right now to do that, but I would be open to it.
And also, are you going to speak with other groups or be on the radio to talk about your experience?
Yes, there's a Canadian broadcaster from the University of Toronto, mostly UNAC. UNAC is doing a webinar next Saturday at 10 a.m. our time. And Dan will also be on board there. And, I invite people to tune into that. We just plan to have it 60 to 75 minutes. And Dan is very eloquent. So I think it should be interesting. And I hope to have, I might have the photo display set up before then. And, it's possible that we'll show some photos there as well. But primarily, I want to do that separately so that anybody can look at the photos and see them, and we can show more without having to, take time away from the program.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, send us the link if you have that for that UNAC program.
Okay, I'll be happy to.
Thank you, Dan.
Okay, next is Trajan, followed by Amihan, followed by Jean. Trajan, did I pronounce your name correctly? Please go ahead.
Tryon.
Tryon,
Tryon.
sorry.
That's all right. I guess my question would be is when you said they're provoking Russia, they definitely are provoking Russia. It almost seems that they want to provoke Russia to use nuclear weapons. It's like every week they send a more advanced weapon to the NATO Ukrainian army to use to strike Russian territory. And it's just escalating. And so what is your opinion on that?
Well, thanks for that question, Trajan. We talked with some people in Russia who believe this is going to go to nuclear war. They make a hard-headed assessment. I heard that Daniel Ellsberg, which is, he's approaching the end. Somebody who talked to him recently said that he thinks it's a 1 in 6. So we've got a 16% chance of going to nuclear war. Some people, as I say, in Russia are very gloomy about the prospects. And I think anybody who's realistic knows that it actually is possible, either intentionally or through accident. We're getting so close, and the breakdown of communications, which could prevent an accidental or could somehow resolve an accidental tripwire. It's getting really, really dangerous and bad. I think it's the escalation of the conflict is nightmarish. But I look at the US empire, which now has, $22 trillion deficit with $1 trillion a year or more and rising. All of the problems of the empire, the breakdown of cities, walking around San Francisco, downtown San Francisco. I was in Sacramento a month and a half ago, and it's a homeless camp. The poverty, the impoverishment, the inequity in the United States is just getting so severe, and the fact that the empire is that countries that formerly were totally beholden to the US are now saying F you. Saudi Arabia being a prime example, is a sign of the breakup of the empire. So, in desperation, who knows what they're going to do? I think it's really tragic that there is not a more active and vocal left. I think it's a huge mistake that some sectarian parts of the left don't want to ally with libertarians or Republicans who are anti-war. I think that's a huge mistake. And it's really incumbent on us to try to get control of our government, because if my contention is true, it's our government that's driving this whole thing, and it's going to drive us all over the cliff. I firmly believe that Russia would not launch first strike, but I'm not nearly sure that the U.S. would.
To your station at 4.
Yeah. So.
Okay, next is Amihan. if you would unmute yourself and please ask your question.
Hi, so this is a good segue, like since you were kind of starting this conversation already. I was thinking about how to like convince the masses about joining the anti-war movement. In my previous jobs, like I've discussed this topic with coworkers, you know, when it comes to, there's a lot of like businesses and stuff like that have like pro-Ukraine stuff, fundraisers and all that stuff. So I would, you know, show them evidence of neo-Nazis in Ukraine that our government is supporting, of NATO's involvement and provoking Russia, of the bombing of the Donbass and stuff like that. And there tends to be two things that happen, or one of two things happen. Either they don't believe you and they say like, oh, this is like, you know, like Russian propaganda, quote unquote, or they do believe you, but don't feel motivated enough to take action on it. So I was wondering, how do you think we can solve this problem so that we can materially combat US warmongering with a sense of strategy and escalate the anti-war movement to be more than just holding signs outside of City Hall that say no to war?
Well, great questions. You got asked the $64,000 question, Mihan. As to neo-Nazis in Ukraine, I think it's you can use the establishment because Congress itself outlawed the Azov Battalion. They passed legislation, said that any defensive weapons any weapons to Ukraine must not go to the Azov Battalion. So they were recognizing there was neo-Nazi forces. And Time Magazine in 2019 did a video about just that subject, about the neo-Nazis in Ukraine and the fact they were it was kind of a magnet for Nazi inclined people from all over the world. So we can use some of the establishment media for that. And why are they no longer admitting that or talking about that now? Like you say, if you talk about that, they'll dismiss you as a Russian propagandist. Well, this is their determination from just a few years ago. I guess in terms of how to mobilize more people, I think there are some Republicans who are much more on board with this now. They're saying, well, why is it the U.S. Why does the U.S. have to spend $100 billion in Ukraine, propping up the Ukrainian government, supplying with all the weapons and so on and so forth? So I think the material interest is one factor. What could we have done at home with that $100 billion that we shipped to Ukraine, with a good chunk of it being siphoned off into corruption and who knows where? By the way, it could also be siphoned off into terrorist organizations, and it probably has. But I think appealing to the material interest of Americans is that this doesn't have to be our fight. And if you talk about, if they want to say, democracy's at stake here, that's a bunch of BS, because Ukraine for years eliminated all the opposition parties. They imprisoned the leaders of opposition parties. Even the Orthodox Church leaders have been shut down. So in numerous, the notion that we're defending democracy is BS.
Okay, last question is Gene, if you would unmute yourself, please go ahead.
Am I unmuted? Yeah.
You're okay.
Well, thanks so much, Rick. Really appreciate, I lead a sheltered life here in Oakland, but I really appreciate people such as yourself doing all this work. And on the nuclear issue, I just want to note that, not only was the United States the only country to actually bomb another country, but within months of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they were using their nuclear monopoly to threaten the Soviet Union, which was an ally and had no nuclear weapons at that time. So I think that's a crucial point to keep in mind. But I also I appreciate the fact you brought China into the equation here, because many people worry that, China is the next country that has its, is in the target of the United States. And, my son married a Chinese woman from Taiwan. So I am very concerned about this personally, but also politically, the anti-China, anti-Asian worries that people have here in the United States. So I wonder if you could comment on that a little bit. And again, thanks for everything you do, and urge people to join Veterans for Peace as a peace organization.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Gene. And just in passing, Gene is the president of Veterans for Peace 162, that is the East Bay chapter, and he does a tremendous job leading that organization, which I am an associate member of. And regarding China, I guess, in one respect, it's the saving grace that Russia has allied with China in the struggle to build a multipolar world with respect for the United Nations and the United Nations Charter and international law. That's the, I think if anything will save us, it's that, because we know that the US empire doesn't, it goes after countries that have been greatly weakened and that it knows it can take down, or that thinks it can take down, whether it's Iraq or Libya, or they thought they could take down Vietnam, they failed at that. They thought they could take down Korea, they failed at that. I think any sensible person knows that the U.S. cannot take on Russia and China. And Tucker Carlson, before he was taken off the air, was commenting about this, how stupid the Biden administration is in fomenting war with both, because we're going to lose. And he was explicit about that. So, I think it's incumbent for progressives to demand respect for international law, demand respect, the U.S. stop intervening in the foreign affairs of other countries like China, and in the case of Taiwan, that's an internal affair. And Russia has a right to be concerned about Ukraine coming under the U.S. NATO sphere of influence, or becoming a member of that. And just kind of in closing, I'll point out the irony. When we were in Crimea, we went to Yalta and we looked at the famous statue. There's a statue of Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. There's a famous photograph of the three of them, and they've got the round table there where they met, and there's a fabulous palace at Yalta where the meetings took place and where they discussed the spheres of influence after World War II. This war in Ukraine is so unnecessary, because just as Mearsheimer said 8 or 10 years ago, if the U.S. refuses to admit that Russia has any security concerns and they take over Ukraine just as they've done, Russia will react. And Mearsheimer predicted it, and the statue of the big three at the end of World War II, that was them acknowledging that, it wasn't just Roosevelt dictating to the world how things would be. It was the three of them having some discussion, a grown-up discussion about what would transpire. Now, one can have various critiques of that, of the decisions there, but the issue at stake, I think, is ultimately whether it's a one world that's ruled by the U.S. versus a multipolar world. And it's clear which way history is moving. The U.S. empire is in decline, and we need to do everything we can to hasten that, because the vast majority of American public is not benefiting from the U.S. empire. All of the wars of aggression abroad, how much who has benefited from that? Nobody. So whether it's schooling, education, housing, whatever issue, we're going to be better off by getting rid of the empire and just taking the best qualities of America and discarding the worst. And it's the aggression and the the notions of supremacy and exceptionalism that are among the worst. So I'll leave it at that. It's been great to be with you, and look forward to more contact in the future.
Thank you, Rick, very much for coming today and presenting. Great discussion. Just want to remind everybody that next week Greg Godels will be speaking. You can sign up for our email notification list at icssmarks.org. So thank you, Rick, and I'm going to stop the recording here.
Institute for the Critical Study of Society at the Nebel Proctor Marxist Library receives no corporate funding, nor do we have any paid staff. We rely on the support of working class folks that share our commitment to the socialist legacy of Karl Marx. We continue to need funds to meet necessary expenses. Since we can no longer pass the hat at our in-person forums, please send contributions to our treasurer, either online via PayPal or by check. The PayPal ID is ICSS Sunday, SUNDAY, at yahoo.com, and the name is Richard Fallenbaum. And checks may be made out to Richard Fallenbaum and sent to him at 1225 Nielsen Street, Berkeley, California, 94706. Fallenbaum is spelled Fallenbaum. To donate directly to the Marxist Library, send a check to the Nebel Proctor Marxist Library at 6501 Telegraph Avenue, Oakland, California, 94609, or directly or donate online at www.paypal.me/npml. For information, write to npml at marxistlibr.org, and the website is marxistlibr.org.